If you know anything about what happened to Lily and Jack, a dash cam clip, a receipt, an unedited video, preserve that file right now and contact the RCMP or Crime Stoppers. Do not edit it. Do not compress it. Original metadata could be the difference between justice and silence. Now, here's what the evidence trail actually looks like. Does he believe the investigation is moving in the right direction? From the outside, the case of 2 missing children looks like a nightmare frozen in time. No arrests, no confirmed location, no closure. But from the inside, from the perspective of someone standing at the center of the storm, the picture looks different. Strikingly different. I'm fairly happy with what they're doing, he said. Not devastated. Not desperate. Fairly happy. Those 2 words have rattled in the minds of everyone following this case since the moment they left his mouth. When your children are missing, when every hour without answers is another hour closer to an outcome no parent should ever imagine, fairly happy is not the language grief reaches for. It's the language of someone managing a situation. Someone watching a process unfold and calculating whether it's going the way they need it to go. He acknowledged that specialized human remains detection dogs had taken a long time to arrive on scene. Months, in fact. Nearly 3 months elapsed between the moment 2 small children vanished from a remote rural property and the moment those K-9 units were finally deployed. To the public, that delay was maddening. But to him, he described it as things falling into place. Delayed but not derailed. Slow but acceptable. For some people it's not fast enough, he admitted. And then, almost casually, he pivoted to the polygraph. The lie detector test he says he took. The questions that came at him in waves. The same ones. Over and over. Circling back and pressing harder each time. Until investigators slid a piece of paper across the table showing him the results. He passed. That's what he says. He passed. And he wants to do it again. As many times as it takes. He volunteered that information without being pushed. He even suggested bringing in different polygraph examiners, fresh eyes, new hands on equipment, as though the legitimacy of the test itself depended on rotating the personnel administering it. I told investigators, I'll do as many polygraphs as it takes. That kind of offer sounds like transparency. It sounds like a man with nothing to hide, throwing open every door, turning on every light. But investigators have seen this move before. Volunteering excessive cooperation can be a strategic performance as much as a genuine gesture. What mattered to the RCMP was not the offer itself, but what the test results actually showed, and whether those results aligned with the physical, digital, and forensic evidence accumulating on the other side of the investigation. There was something else, he said, that investigators took note of. When asked whether he thought the cadaver dogs would find anything, he didn't hesitate. He didn't say, I hope not. He didn't say, I pray they don't find anything terrible. He said, with the kind of certainty that sits uncomfortably in a parent's mouth, I know for 100% they won't find anything. 100% certain. Not hopeful. Certain. When you are a parent and your children are missing and the authorities are sending human remains detection dogs across your property, certainty is not the emotional register most people operate in. Terror is. Desperation is. Certainty belongs to someone who already knows what those dogs will and won't find, and more importantly, where. He also pushed for something that stopped investigators mid-stride. He said the individuals who discovered the fragment of blanket, the only piece of potential physical evidence recovered during the public search phase, had never been polygraphed. And he wanted that to change. He wanted the people who found the blanket to sit in that chair and answer questions under pressure. Because he argued, anyone involved in finding the only possible piece of evidence in the case should be scrutinized just as hard as a family. It was a clever deflection or a legitimate concern, depending entirely on which version of the story turns out to be true. Investigators noted it either way. What the public was watching was a man performing the language of cooperation, while simultaneously demonstrating an unsettling level of calm. And somewhere between that calm and that certainty, investigators began building a case that would stretch far beyond the tree line, far beyond the property, and deep into the digital and financial life of everyone present the night those 2 children were last seen alive. Part 2. The last time anyone outside a household saw Lily and Jack alive was captured not by a neighbor's doorbell camera or a passing driver's dash cam, but by the cold in different lenses of a retail store surveillance system. May 1st, a family walking through the aisles of what investigators believe was a Dollarama or equivalent store. Normal, unremarkable. Two children moving through fluorescent light beside the adults responsible for their safety. That footage became the spine of the entire investigation. In missing persons cases, investigators build timelines the way engineers build bridges, from fixed anchor points outward, testing every span for load-bearing strength before moving forward. The May 1st retail footage was the last anchor point that came from outside the family's control. Every hour that followed was unverified. Every account of what happened next came from within the household itself. And that is precisely where the investigation began to fracture. Between that final retail sighting and the moment the children were officially reported missing, investigators identified a gap of nearly 20 hours. 20 hours with no third-party confirmation. No neighbor who heard the children playing. No delivery driver who saw them at the door. No time-stamped footage from an independent source confirming their presence, their condition, or even their existence inside that property. 20 hours during which every detail about the children's lives depended entirely on the testimony of the adults who were with them. That gap did not simply raise questions. It restructured the entire investigation. When a child vanishes from an urban street, the evidence ecosystem is dense. Security cameras on every corner. Ring doorbells on every porch. Transit systems with passenger logs. Restaurants with credit card records. The city itself becomes a witness. But on a remote rural property, those external eyes disappear. The trees don't record. The fields don't timestamp. And when the only contemporaneous accounts of the child's final hours come exclusively from within the walls of the home they lived in, investigators cannot simply take those accounts at face value. Not when children are missing and the clock is running. The problem was not just the gap itself. It was what investigators found when they tried to close it. Statements about bedtime routines shifted. In one interview, the children were put to bed at a certain hour. In another interview, the timeline moved. The sequence of which rooms were occupied, which doors were open or closed, who checked on the children, and when. These details, the kind of granular mundane specifics that should be easiest to recall because they are habitual, began to drift. Not dramatically, not in ways that screamed deception immediately, but enough. Enough that when investigators overlaid those shifting accounts against phone records, utility data, and the limited external footage they could gather from neighboring properties, the inconsistencies hardened into something they could not dismiss. Small changes to reported routines become enormous problems in a forensic timeline. An adult who puts children to bed at 8:30 in one interview and then describes an entirely different evening sequence in a follow-up interview has created a gap that investigators must fill. They must find the fixed data points. A text message sent at a specific time, a security light triggered by motion, a vehicle captured passing a road camera, and use those objective markers to determine which version of events, if either, is accurate. And then came the gas station footage. Surveillance cameras at a local gas station captured Daniel Martel at times that did not align with the timeline he had originally provided to investigators. This is a moment in a forensic inquiry when everything shifts gear. When recorded video contradicts a witness statement, investigators are no longer dealing with the soft uncertainty of human memory. They are dealing with a provable discrepancy. The question becomes surgical. Was a statement wrong because memory failed under extraordinary stress, or was it wrong because it was constructed? Video evidence does not lie about when it was recorded. It does not misremember. It doesn't experience grief or shock or the cognitive collapse that genuine trauma can produce. A timestamp on surveillance footage is fixed. And when that fixed timestamp places a person somewhere other than where their own account says they were, the investigation pivots from broad search to targeted reconstruction. Investigators began pulling every thread connected to that discrepancy. Vehicle movement logs, fuel purchase records, cell tower pings. The goal was not to embarrass or entrap. It was to compress the ambiguity, to replace possibly here with confirmed here at this time across the full arc of those critical missing hours. Because somewhere inside that 20-hour window, two children went from alive to gone, and the investigation was now certain the answer did not lie in the wilderness beyond the property line. It lay much, much closer to home. There is a particular kind of silence that cash creates. It leaves no digital echo. It triggers no bank notification. It generates no transaction record that investigators can subpoena, no receipt that can be cross-referenced against a timeline, no merchant record linking a purchase to a person at a specific moment in time. Cash, in the architecture of criminal investigation, is the closest thing to invisibility that the modern financial system allows. And in the weeks leading up to May 2nd, someone inside that household was reaching for that invisibility repeatedly. Investigators flagged multiple cash withdrawals exceeding $2,000 during the period immediately before the children disappeared. Let that sit for a moment. Not a single withdrawal. Multiple. Each one clearing the $2,000 threshold that triggers investigative attention. Each one converting traceable digital wealth into anonymous, untraceable physical currency. Each one representing a transaction that, once completed, becomes nearly impossible to follow unless the cash itself is recovered or a witness can place the money in a specific context. In isolation, large cash withdrawals mean nothing sinister. People pay contractors in cash. They settle debts. They travel. They stockpile emergency funds. The existence of a withdrawal is not evidence of wrongdoing. Investigators know this, and they are careful not to treat financial behavior as inherently suspicious without context. But context is everything. And in this case, the context surrounding those withdrawals was anything but ordinary. The withdrawals occurred during a period of documented financial strain within the household. Unsealed court materials and investigative records painted a picture of mounting pressure, bills accumulating, resources thinning, the low-grade panic of a household trying to keep its head above water while the financial floor continued to drop. That kind of stress does not cause criminality. It does not flip a switch in a person's character and transform them into someone capable of harming the people they love most. But it creates conditions. It compresses decision-making. It accelerates the kind of desperate, poorly calculated choices that people in stable circumstances would never contemplate. When investigators see large cash withdrawals in the midst of confirmed financial distress, they ask a specific set of questions. Was the cash used to rent storage space that doesn't appear in any lease agreement? Was it used to pay for transportation that bypassed digital booking systems? Was it used to purchase supplies, tarps, containers, cleaning materials that leave no credit card trail and no searchable receipt? In a case involving missing children, those questions are not paranoid. They are procedurally mandatory. Investigators cross-reference the withdrawal dates against surveillance footage from ATMs, against fuel purchase records, against any retail transaction that might reveal how and where that cash moved after it left the bank. Where those trails went cold, where the cash seemed to dissolve into the timeline without explanation. Investigators documented the gaps and treated them as active leads requiring resolution. But the financial picture was only one layer of a much more disturbing portrait emerging from the forensic analysis. Because while investigators were tracing cash through bank records and surveillance logs, another team was doing something that would have been unimaginable to investigators 20 years ago. They were reading someone's mind, or at least the closest digital approximation of it. Internet search history is not a confession. Courts have held consistently that looking something up does not prove you acted on it. People research disturbing topics out of anxiety, morbid curiosity, and a compulsive need to understand worst-case scenarios. A parent terrified their child might wander near a river, might search water survival statistics. A person processing grief might search details about death that seem alarming without context. Digital forensics experts know this, and they approach search history with measured analytical caution. But patterns are different from individual searches. Isolated queries can be explained away. Patterns, especially patterns that cluster around specific time windows and align with other evidence streams, tell a different story entirely. Investigators recovered device activity that included searches about child survival in cold conditions, methods for concealing evidence, how search operations are conducted, and, most chillingly, queries that implied specific knowledge of law enforcement techniques, including K-9 detection methods. These were not casual, scattered searches spread across months of general internet browsing. They were focused, concentrated, temporally specific. and their timing relative to the children's disappearance and the investigation that followed placed them in a category that investigators could not dismiss as coincidental curiosity. The digital footprint was beginning to outline the shape of something deliberate. There is nothing in a missing child investigation that signals a fundamental shift in operational focus, quite like the arrival of human remains detection dogs. Their deployment is not a routine search measure. It is not what investigators reach for when they still believe a child might be found alive in the wilderness, sheltering beneath a fallen tree, or hiding in a neighbor's barn. Cadaver dogs are a declaration, quiet, clinical, and devastating, that the investigation has crossed a threshold, that the working hypothesis has changed, that the people running this case are no longer primarily looking for a living child. They are looking for what remains. The K-9 units arrived months after the children were first reported missing. He had been asking for them, he said publicly, for the better part of 3 months. He was glad they were finally here. He even hoped they would bring more than one unit, if additional teams were available. He said this with the steady, cooperative energy of a man eager for process to proceed. Because he said with that same unsettling certainty he had deployed before, he already knew what the dogs would find. Or, more precisely, what they would not find. I know for 100% they won't find anything. Investigators heard that statement. They filed it. They noted the specificity of the confidence, the absence of the hedging language that genuine uncertainty produces, and they sent the dogs in any way, across the property, through the vegetation that had grown dense and wild over the months since the children vanished, across soil and brush and the ground cover that accumulates during a Canadian spring and summer, and transforms a search zone into something that requires specialized training to navigate systematically. The dogs indicated at multiple locations. Not one, not a single concentrated alert that pointed investigators immediately to a specific site requiring excavation. Multiple locations across the property showed interest from the handlers' trained animals. Behavior responses at K-9 specialists are trained to interpret, document, and report with precision. Each indication became a flag zone. Each flag zone triggered additional forensic sampling. Soil samples were taken. Laboratory analysis was initiated. The science of cadaver dog indications is complicated enough that no single alert constitutes conclusive proof of anything. Scent migrates, weather redistributes it. Animal activity can create false positives, and human passage across a site can introduce variables that complicate interpretation. Handlers know this. Investigators know this, which is why each indication is treated as a directional signal rather than a definitive answer. But multiple indications across multiple locations on the same property? That pattern elevates the signal considerably. What made those K-9 results particularly significant in this investigation was not just what the dogs responded to. It was where their responses clustered relative to the locations described in family testimony about the children's movements on the night they were last seen. The geography of the indications, mapped against the geography of the accounts investigators had collected across months of interviews, created an overlap that deepened the investigative focus on the property rather than dispersing it outward into the surrounding wilderness. And the property itself had a history that predated the disappearance. A history that educators and school staff had been quietly documenting for months before Lily and Jack were ever reported missing. Teachers noticed. That is a devastating simplicity at the heart of what followed. Before May 2nd, before the search parties, before the media coverage and the public vigils and the cadaver dogs and the sealed warrants, before any of the machinery of formal investigation was set in motion, the people who saw those children most regularly during their waking hours had already raised the alarm. Multiple times. Unexplained bruising. Welfare concerns documented in formal school reports. Referrals triggered and filed and followed up on with the variable urgency that characterizes child protection systems under strain. Those prior welfare contacts were pulled into the investigative record and examined with the same forensic rigor applied to the digital and financial evidence. Previous welfare referrals do not, standing alone, constitute proof of abuse. Children sustain injuries in ordinary play. They bruise from falls, from rough-and-tumble contact with siblings and classmates, from the normal physical chaos of childhood. But patterns matter in welfare records the same way they matter in internet search histories and financial transactions. One report can be explained. Two reports require attention. A recurring thread of concerns documented across time by multiple independent observers, teachers, school staff, individuals with no coordinating relationship to one another, creates a cumulative record that investigators cannot interpret as coincidence. The question that record raised was not just what had been happening inside that household. It was what had been missed. What intervention opportunities had passed without producing protection. What moments of potential rescue had come and gone before May 2nd made everything permanent. That question did not belong exclusively to the investigators. It belonged to a system. And the system, too, would have to answer. Investigations do not solve themselves through single explosive revelations. They do not pivot on one dramatic piece of evidence that collapses every competing theory and delivers certainty in a clean, cinematic moment. Real forensic inquiries are built through accumulation, layer press against layer, each individual element insufficient on its own, but each one adding structural weight to a framework that eventually becomes too dense to dismiss. What the RCMP had constructed by the time the cadaver dogs left the property and a laboratory analysis began was not a single smoking gun. It was an architecture, and that architecture told a story. Start at the beginning. May 1st. A family inside a retail store, captured on surveillance cameras, moving through aisles under fluorescent light. Two children visible, present, alive. That footage was the last independent confirmation of Lily and Jack's existence that came from outside the household's control. Everything that followed, every account of those children's final hours, every description of bedtime routines and evening sequences, and who checked on whom and when, came exclusively from the adults who were with them. And those accounts did not hold their shape under scrutiny. Bedtime routines shifted between interviews. Door positions changed. The sequence of movements inside the house drifted. These were not dramatic reversals. No one walked into an interrogation room and provided a completely contradictory version of events from one session to the next. The shifts were subtle, incremental, the kind of variation that genuine memory sometimes produces under stress, and the kind that deliberate reconstruction also produces when constructed narrative begins to develop small structural cracks under pressure of repeated questioning. Investigators did not treat those inconsistencies as proof of guilt. They treated them as a mandate to seek corroboration, to find the fixed, immovable data points that would either support one version of events or undermine it. And when they reached for those fixed points, phone records, utility data, neighboring property camera footage, what they found did not resolve the inconsistencies. In several critical instances, it deepened them. The gas station footage placed Daniel Martel in a location that his original timeline did not account for. That discrepancy forced investigators to reconstruct his movements during the critical window with greater precision, pulling vehicle records, fuel transaction data, and cell tower information to establish where he actually was and when. That kind of reconstruction is painstaking and slow. It requires assembling fragments from multiple independent sources and testing them against each other until a coherent, verifiable sequence emerges. But when it works, when the fragments align into a picture that contradicts the stated account, it produces the kind of evidence that courtrooms are built to evaluate. Layer the financial record on top of that. Multiple cash withdrawals above $2,000, occurring during a period of confirmed household financial strain, timed in proximity to the critical gaps in the investigative timeline. Untraceable by design once the cash left the bank and entered circulation, investigators could establish that the money was withdrawn. They could establish when and where, what they needed, what laboratory analysis and continued forensic work was aimed at producing, was evidence of what that cash had purchased and whether those purchases connected to physical evidence or absence of evidence on the property. Then layer the digital record. Targeted internet searches about child survival in cold conditions. Queries about concealing evidence. Research into search operation methodology. Questions about K9 detection capabilities that went beyond casual curiosity and into the operational specifics of how law enforcement animals are deployed and what they can and cannot detect. These searches did not occur in a vacuum. They occurred in a specific time window. They occurred on devices belonging to people inside the household and their temporal relationship to the disappearance before, during, and after the critical period. Place them in an interpretive context that investigators could not ignore. Lay the K9 indications across that framework. Multiple locations on the property where trained human remains detection animals show behavioral responses consistent with scent presence. Sites that were then sampled and submitted for laboratory analysis. Sites whose geographic relationship to the families described movements and routines inside that property created a spatial pattern that pointed investigators toward specific zones for intensified forensic examination. And then, beneath all of it, the welfare reports. The teachers who had noticed, the bruising that had been documented, the referrals that had been filed before any of this became a national story. The cumulative record of institutional concern about the safety of those two children that had been accumulating quietly in school files and social services records long before May 2nd made that concern permanently, irreversibly urgent. Each layer alone was explainable. Each element in isolation carried enough ambiguity that a skilled defense argument could have neutralized it. But together they constructed something far more difficult to dismantle. A pattern in which the children's final hours existed entirely within the controlled environment of the household. A pattern in which the adults responsible for their safety provided accounts that bent under investigative pressure. A pattern in which financial behavior, digital activity, and physical evidence on the property all converged on a conclusion that wilderness searches and public tip lines were never going to deliver. The answer was never out there. It was always right here. Justice is not fast. It was never designed to be. The machinery of a serious criminal investigation moves at a pace that feels obscene to people watching from the outside, to the communities demanding answers, to the extended family members caught in the orbit of an unbearable uncertainty, to the public that has been following the case of two missing children through media coverage and social media speculation, and the particular agony of the story that refuses to resolve. The slowness feels like failure. It is not. It is the price of accuracy. And in cases like this one, accuracy is the only currency that matters. Everything investigators had assembled, the retail footage anchor, the 20-hour gap, the shifting bedtime accounts, the contradictory gas station surveillance, the cash withdrawals, the targeted internet searches, the cadaver dog indications, the prior welfare reports. Each piece of that evidentiary architecture was only as strong as its verification. A cash withdrawal becomes meaningful when corroborated by a receipt, a purchase record, or physical evidence linking the money to a specific action. A troubling internet search becomes significant when its timing is precisely mapped and its content is placed in documented sequence alongside other investigative findings. A K9 indication becomes actionable when laboratory sampling either confirms or fails to confirm the presence of biological material at the flag site. Without that corroboration, without the slow, meticulous work of converting a pattern of suspicion into a constellation of verified facts, none of it holds up. Not in a courtroom, not in front of a judge, not under the scrutiny of defense counsel whose job is to dismantle every link in the evidentiary chain and force the prosecution to rebuild it stronger. Good investigation is not about building the fastest case. It is about building the right one that does not collapse under cross-examination. One that delivers not just charges, but convictions that survive appeal and stand permanently in the record. That kind of evidence, delivered directly to investigators without contamination, without public circulation, without editing. That is the contribution that closes cases. That is the difference between a piece of footage that confirms a timeline and a piece of footage that has been so thoroughly distributed across social media platforms that its evidential integrity is permanently compromised. What does not help? What actively damages the investigation and potentially endangers the possibility of justice is the circulation of unverified screenshots, edited clips, and speculation-driven theories that crowd the information environment and make it harder for genuine witnesses to come forward without being absorbed into the noise. Every unauthenticated image that circulates as though it is evidence is a contamination event. Every theory promoted as fact is a potential misdirection. Every witness who sees their account mangled in online speculation becomes a more complicated witness to manage in a formal investigative context. Lily and Jack deserve better than that. They deserve an investigation that reaches its conclusion with its evidentiary record intact. They deserve a legal process that has not been compromised by the well-intentioned but genuinely destructive impulse to crowdsource justice in real time. They deserve the slow, painstaking, methodical work of investigators who are not racing the news cycle, but building something that will last. The pattern is clear. The framework is constructed. The forensic work continues. And somewhere inside the gap between what is known and what can be proven, in the laboratory results, the financial cross-references, the digital forensic analysis still being processed, the answer that Lily and Jack deserve is being assembled one verified fact at a time. Hold the line. Let the investigators work. And if you know something, anything verifiable, anything time-stamped, anything original, make the call. If you have watched all 6 parts of the series and you have original evidence connected to this case, contact the RCMP or Crime Stoppers right now. Preserve your original file. Do not edit it. Do not share it publicly. Deliver it directly to investigators. And if this series has given you a clearer picture of how serious criminal investigations actually work, share it with someone who needs to understand what is at stake. Lily and Jack's story is not over. Justice requires your silence on social media and your voice in the right rooms. Make the call.